Well, it's been a while since the Savage tier released. Yeah, it's been a while. However, I wanted to make a thoughts video on it because I never really made one, and now would probably be a good time. One thing that's always brewing in the back of my mind when I do a fight is how much I enjoy it or not. And I could probably do a similar video on how I enjoy each of the ultimates if that's interesting, but for now, I want to specifically talk about the light heavyweight tier of the Arcadion, which just released 2 months ago. Yeah, it's been a while. There's a lot to go into in terms of like the build up into Savage and how Dawntrail's content was a bit of a change of pace in very small ways, but I want to just focus on the tier itself. The 4 fights that we got, they're Savage versions, obviously, and how I felt about them both in terms of progging and re-clearing. First, I'm going to lay out a couple of ground rules for this. First, these are entirely my opinions. If you agree or disagree, I'd like to hear what you have to say in the comments. Secondly, this is coming from mainly a tanking perspective, since that is how I progged the fights and that's how I re-cleared them. I haven't really learned them on other roles, just tank. And this is also coming from the perspective of someone who progged, cleared, and re-cleared all these fights in Party Finder. I was able to barely clear in the first week in Party Finder exclusively, and have done re-clears for the past 2 months. Yeah, 2 months. So with all that explained and out of the way, let's talk about each of these fights, because they're fairly interesting. First up, we have Black Cat, and being the first fight of the tier, this fight isn't particularly difficult. It almost feels like Extreme Plus, but that's kind of the point, because if you have the first fight be super fucking difficult, then that's going to turn a lot of people off. Really, the main point of the first fight is to get people into the idea of Savage, especially if they're newer, to show them that the content's a bit harder than what they're used to, but it's not so hard that it's going to be impossible for you to clear. And I think in terms of that, and also just being a fun fight, I think Black Cat was an outstanding success. One of my favorite things about this fight is that pulling the boss to specific points in the map actually matters. Most bosses in Endwalker had hitboxes the size of the map, so pulling them around would be either A, impossible, or B, a gigantic pain in the ass that wasn't even worth it anyway. However, for this fight, pulling the boss around actually matters for 9 Lives 2 in particular, because you're going to have to pay attention to what direction the boss moved for her actual mechanics, on top of what the mechanics are, and stuff like that, and then they're stored into clones, and then the tank ends up pulling the boss to where the clone is going to move to, which makes the actual mechanics significantly easier. It's a very small thing, but it's stuff like this that I want to see more often. It's so much fun, and it's also incredibly rewarding for the tank themselves. I want to see more of this. Mauser's also a pretty fun mechanic, since the arena is made significantly smaller and you have to make sure you don't break the ground, and also paying attention to what the clone's doing to see if they're going to either knock you up or smack you down, which does change things. I also thought that the clone mechanics in general were also pretty fun, especially since they are memory mechanics which can get kind of dull sometimes, but in this case you're not only having to remember what the mechanic was that the boss did, but you also have to do it relative to the new positions of the clones, which I think is a small thing, but it's a very interesting thing. The fight is also just fun to come back to. It's not hard, but it doesn't need it to be, and for what it is, I think it fulfills its job really well. There are a couple things I don't like about it. For example, the tank buster is extremely unthreatening, and the fact that raining cats can be invuln stratted is extremely lame. Why are we doing this? However, those complaints are relatively minor, and the fight itself is just fun in general. I don't really have much else to say. It's a good fight. It's a good introduction to Savage for newer players, and it's just a fun fight in general. That's it. Moving on. Next, we have Honey Be Lovely, and this fight sucks. Genuinely, I think this fight is awful. And actually, hang on. Pause the music. I'm gonna play something different that encapsulates my feelings on this fight a lot better. Masterpiece. Anyway, what was I saying? Oh yeah, this fight is awful. I guess I'll get the positives out of the way. I think Alarm Pheromones 2 was pretty cool. I liked how it was handled. It's not very complicated, but I'm scraping at the bottom of the barrel here because it's the only mechanic in this fight that I enjoy. Pretty much all the mechanics in this fight I find really either annoying or just unfun. Sometimes both. One thing that's kind of underrated about fights is pacing. If a fight is paced in certain ways, it'll make the fight feel fast, or it'll make it feel slow. Both Black Cat and Honeybee Lovely are similar in terms of length. They're like just shy of 10 minutes, but Black Cat feels like it goes by in 5, and Honeybee Lovely feels like it goes by in 15. Beat 1, for instance, is an incredibly slow mechanic, and it just feels like it drags on forever. Beat 2 goes by fairly quickly, but Beat 2 sets off one of my biggest pet peeves of having 2 stack markers on top of each other and being allowed to live. Not only live, but it also successfully does the mechanic correctly, which makes no fucking sense at all. I don't like her Tank Buster because either way it doesn't really do that much damage, and some people might say, oh, you have really strong tools. No, the damage is just so low compared to the tools we have. Like, holy shit, these Tank Busters do no damage at all. Honestly, her auto attacks are more threatening than her Tank Busters. Not even joking, the auto attacks hit decently hard, and the Tank Buster does not. I also don't like the song at all. Like, it's one of those songs where I'm just like, alright, enter /BGM and turn the music off. Like, that's literally what I have to do. And it makes me keep my sanity at least a little bit longer. Also, Alarm Pheromones 1 can go die. I don't think I need to explain myself for that one. Honestly, to me, Honeybee Lovely feels like the antithesis of Black Cat, where they took everything good about that fight and then just made it about 10 times worse and then shipped it. Some people might say that it's Party Finder that's making me not like this fight, and to that I say, I also had Party Finder struggles with the next 2 fights, and I think those 2 fights are significantly better in just about every way. So for the sake of me not sounding incredibly monotone for the rest of the video, I'm just going to move on. Like 2 out of 10. I'm rating these fights now, I guess. Yeah, 2 out of 10. Next we have Brute Bomber, and thankfully the positives have come back with a vengeance, because I have a whole lot of stuff to say about this fight. Mostly good. Mostly good. Honestly, after thinking about it, I think this fight might actually be my favorite of the tier. I sung the praises of Black Cat earlier, but Brute Bomber, ooh man, this fight is so much fun. One of my favorite mechanics happens at the very start, and it's Barbarous Barrage. You know, the knockback towers? I think the knockback towers mechanic is just, it's so much fun. It's so short and it's pretty simple, but it's just so satisfying to do correctly because you're just bouncing all over the map, and then you have to get behind him as he does his giant 270-degree cleave. It's a really creative mechanic and I like it a lot. I also like just how much damage the boss does, especially since he decides,
that's right, we're gonna cheat.
He ends up doing so much more damage on everything. His raid wides do more damage, his tank busters do more damage, I'm pretty sure his auto attacks do more damage as well, and they also hit more, which is just, ooh, it's spicy, it's very spicy. Also, this fight doesn't rely on memory mechanics at all. Like, it's not a case of he's going to store something for later and then remember it. No, he's like, alright, I'm going to do partner stacks. Do it now, or else. It's a lot more reactive, where he's putting up a thing and he's just like, alright, guess what? Do it now. I guess the only thing that kinda counts as a memory mechanic is Chain Deathmatch, I guess. But I think that, like, barely counts. Plus, I think Chain Deathmatch is pretty good as well. Especially when they combine it with his poison mechanic later on. I think that's a very creative use of the idea, on top of dodging the bombs on the ground. There's just a lot going on in that sequence, and it's a whole lot of fun to execute. Same thing with the whole Fuse or Foe thing, when he does the spinning AoEs, and then the spreads, and then the circle AoEs that turn into rings. I can really just say that most of the mechanics in this fight are just fun to execute. That's really what I can just boil it down to, and I think most people would understand. I do have a couple complaints about this fight. For one, I feel like there are too many times where the boss just sits there and doesn't do anything. Like when he's having a drink, he's not really doing much. Like, imagine if the second time he had a drink, the referee bot came back, and then he picks up the ref bot, and then throws it at one of the tanks as a, like, flare-based tank buster. That would be honestly funnier than hell if they did stuff like that. Also, I'm kind of sad that I don't get to experience the tank busters doing damage anymore, because they just get invulned. Like, dude, that's so lame. I love fearing for my fucking life as I press every single mitt button under the sun on his, like, 8-hit tank buster, and I'm still almost dying. It's so much fun, and we don't get to do that anymore. It's so sad. But if there's any consolation prize, I get to have funny laughs because I'm listening to Metal Face while playing.
This is going to be a blast! Hope I'm not interrupting.
And really, the complaints I had are relatively minor. I still enjoy myself when I do this fight more often than not, which is really one of the biggest things for me personally. I want to have fun when I'm doing these fights, and this fight brings the fun. So, I can't complain too much. And then finally, we have Wicked Thunder, and oh man, there is a lot to talk about with this fight, so let's get right into it. One of the big things about this fight is the fact that it's not a door boss. Thank God. We had 4 of them in a row, and I'm glad that they didn't do it this time. However, there came some downsides to it, which we'll talk about in a bit. For now, let's talk about the first half. The first half is really good. I like it a lot. Witch hunts are a very fun mechanic to do, with all sorts of randomness. It's the kind of randomness that makes the mechanic feel very different whenever you do it multiple times, but it's not so different that it requires you to do like completely different strategies. It's just right, in my opinion. Also, Electro Edge 2 is a mechanic that I enjoy thoroughly, because it's a very creative use of the Electro debuff that we get, just giving us growing debuffs depending on how many times we get hit, and then we get hit again in the middle of it, which forces the long players to figure out what they are on the fly, or rather, just by knowing when you get hit at the start. But I think the mechanic is really creative and cool. And then there's the cannons mechanic, which is a whole lot of fun for me personally, since there's a tank buster attached to it, a whole wild charge tank buster that kind of does a lot of damage unless you have a proper mid plan. It's also one of those mechanics that really makes use of the fact that feint and reprisal and stuff last 15 seconds, because if you press it late enough in the cast, then it'll cover the second hit that comes afterward. And rewarding players for timing their mitts like this is a small yet very enjoyable thing for me personally. I like it. Overall, Phase 1 feels pretty fast, especially once you get to Electro Edge 1, where things really start going. And it's just a fun fight. However, you get to the second phase, and then things slow down significantly. While I think the idea of not having a door boss again is a good idea, I personally don't think the second phase was handled very well, unfortunately. First off, I have to give this fight an instant F tier because it has tank buster tethers. Please, no more of these. I'm tired of it. I already got my fill of pain and suffering from these in DSR. Don't stop. No, stop. Please, stop. No more. Overall, the mechanics in the second half of the fight just feel a lot less creative than the first half, which kind of sucks, because we were already given an example of a fight that the boss doesn't move and is still very engaging with Valley Garmanda, and I feel like this fight does not do that at all. Like, none of the mechanics feel really engaging compared to the rest of the fight, which sucks. However, my biggest gripe with this fight, and the reason why I think this fight is only really okay compared to what it could have been, which is great, is Sunrise Sabbath. Holy shit, that mechanic is awful. It is so bad. There's a whole argument of which version of Sunrise is better, and even though normal is objectively superior, it doesn't matter because regardless of what strat you're doing, this mechanic is not fun. It is incredibly unintuitive because it's really hard to tell where you're aiming your cannons, and it's the margin for error for this mechanic is so small compared to the rest of the fight. You had a decent amount of margin for error for the first half of the fight. You don't hear. And if someone says, oh, it's just like Ultimates, no. No Ultimate has this level of pixel precision in the final phase. Not even close. And I feel like having such little margin for error in a mechanic that is 12 minutes into a 13-minute fight, and then having people die because they were just off is so tilting. This kind of thing should not be happening. Not even Ultimates do this type of thing. They usually have simpler mechanics at the end to make sure you're paying attention after a long slog, but nothing this precise. This ultimately makes the fight just feel incredibly unbalanced in and of itself. Like, imagine if Twilight Sabbath and Sunrise Sabbath were swapped. Already the fight would feel significantly more balanced, because you would have a much more precise mechanic earlier, and then you would have Twilight serve as a choke check. You're 12 minutes into the fight, can you read basic AoEs right before the end? However, as it stands, Sunrise Sabbath is a terrible mechanic that is placed poorly within the fight and brings the entire second half of the fight down. I already didn't like the second half of the fight too much because it just felt ridiculously basic compared to the first half, but Sunrise just, oh, it's so poorly placed, dude. I can't with it. Also, I want to bring up something that I didn't bring up in the previous 3 fights because it wasn't a big deal then, but it is now in the form of the DPS check. I feel like for the first 3 fights, the DPS check wasn't that bad at all. Like, I wouldn't expect 1 and 2 to have a tight DPS check. 3 is a little less okay, but it's still fine for what it is. This fight, absolutely not. This DPS check is tuned so low. On one hand, I'm glad that it's this low, that it makes skipping Sunrise a thing, because I don't want to do that mechanic ever again. But on the other hand, Party Finder is an eternal skill issue and can't skip Sunrise to save their life. So, we're gonna have to do it regardless. However, either way, we were skipping Sword Equiver without gear in the first week. Like, what? That shouldn't be a thing that happens. Like, this didn't happen in Asphodelos, this didn't happen in Abyssos, for completely different reasons. Overall, I personally think this fight was just a little bit undercooked. The second half of the fight was significantly less interesting than the first, and the fight was just tuned so low, even ignoring the numerous buffs that Jobs got post Dawntrail's release. Even with those out of the equation, the fight was still undertuned, and I feel like they should really make it so the next final boss isn't this undertuned. I'm not saying give us P8S again, because that's a terrible idea, but come on, we can do better than this. In terms of the raid tier, I do think that this raid tier was pretty good overall. The fights overall were a lot more refreshing and fun to do compared to what we got in Endwalker, because Endwalker, every fight just felt the same and incredibly boring. Here, each fight, for better and for worse, feels all their own, and it makes every fight just feel fresh. On top of having unique OSTs for every fight, which just covers so many different genres compared to before, which is really nice. I also think in terms of keeping up with Dawntrail's idea of just more engaging mechanics, I do think that the Savage tier does succeed overall, even though there were points that I felt were kind of lackluster in that area, especially M4S Phase 2. I do think that overall, the design of this tier was pretty strong, and I really enjoyed my time with it. Like, I would much rather come back to most of these fights than come back to most of Endwalker's offerings. Like, Jesus Christ. However, the tier wasn't perfect. Honeybee Lovely, for example, was a gigantic flop. The fight was not fun. I didn't enjoy anything in that fight. And then, the DPS checks were a little bit rough, but that's mainly an M4S problem. I don't think that the first 2 fight DPS checks were bad. The 3rd fight was questionable, but still fine. But the 4th was not. It also does open up a debate of whether or not a longer Savage fight or a door boss style thing is better, and honestly, I'm not going to go into that right now. There are things that people would say that would be better to do than either of these, but that's not something I want to go into right now. That's its own separate topic. However, I will just say that the way Wicked Thunder specifically was handled wasn't the greatest, and made for a pretty underwhelming fight, which kinda sucks since the first half was pretty strong. However, overall, I do think this was a pretty strong tier and probably the most fun tier in a while. I could talk about mechanics and bullshit all day long, but at the end of the day, the most important thing that I was looking for was, were the fights fun? Difficulty be damned, were the fights fun? And overall, I would say that yes, they were. Black Cat was a very fun fight, Brute Bomber was a very fun fight, and the first half of Wicked Thunder was also really fun. The second half mainly just got some brownie points because of the OST in the background, but in terms of the fight itself, it was kinda rough, and Honeybee Lovely can go rot in hell. But overall, this was a very fun tier, and so, looking at it from that perspective, I think the light heavyweight tier in the Arcadion was a success, and I'm excited to see what we get next tier, probably sometime in April, who knows. And with that, I thank you for watching. This video took a little bit to come out because I was just having issues articulating the things that I wanted to say, and it took me a bit to kind of figure out what I wanted to do to, talk about these fights. But here I am, struggling to say things again. It's fantastic. Moving forward, I do have other things that I do want to talk about, maybe some other guides to make for other jobs, and one of the big things I'm considering is actually streaming on Twitch. It's been a long time since I streamed on Twitch, and it was with a different alias entirely, but I am thinking of starting that up somewhat soon, and if I do, I'll let you guys know. When that will be is to be determined, so we will see on that front. However, until whatever the next thing I do is, I'll see you guys around. Have a good day.